Mercedes just dominated the Chinese Grand Prix, and now the FIA is taking a closer look at their engine. Not after a failure. After total domination. A 1-2 finish. Perfect race pace. And something even more unusual? They never seemed to run out of energy. No drop at the end of the straights. No visible limitations. While everyone else was managing. And that's the detail that changed everything. Because in this new era of Formula One, energy is the limit. It's what controls speed. It's what defines performance. And somehow, Mercedes looked like they had more of it. Lap after lap. No compromise. No weakness. And when one team suddenly finds that kind of advantage, the FIA doesn't ignore it. They investigate it. Now here's why this matters. This is not about a protest. This is not about a penalty, yet. This is about understanding whether Mercedes has found something that others haven't. Or something they shouldn't have. Because if there's even a small irregularity, even a gray area, it could force changes. Immediate changes. And in a season that just started, that can completely reshape the championship. So the real question is not how Mercedes won in China. The real question is, what exactly did they do that made the FIA look closer? What makes this situation even more uncomfortable is how early it's happening. We are only 2 races into the season. 2. And already, one team looks completely in control, while the rest are trying to keep up. That's not normal. Because under brand new regulations, everything is supposed to be closer, more balanced, more unpredictable. Teams are still learning, still adapting, still finding performance. But Mercedes looks like they already found it. From the very first session in China, the signs were there. Fast in practice, comfortable in qualifying, and in the race, untouchable. Not just quicker, cleaner, smoother, more efficient. And this is where the first real question appears. Because speed alone doesn't trigger investigations. Efficiency does. How a car uses energy. How long it can sustain performance. How it behaves when others start to lose power. And in China, Mercedes never seemed to fade. Lap after lap, the same level. No visible drop. No signs of limitation. While other teams were clearly managing. Lifting earlier. Losing deployment at the end of straights. Trying to survive within the system. Mercedes didn't look like they were surviving. They looked like they were controlling it. And that difference is exactly what caught attention. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because this is not just about what we saw on track. It's about what teams see in the data. Speed traces, energy curves, deployment patterns. All of it gets analyzed. Quietly, constantly. And when one team's data doesn't align with expectations, questions begin. Not accusations. Questions. But in Formula One, questions are where everything starts. Because once the FIA starts comparing data, they're not just looking for illegal components. They're looking for behavior. How systems operate under pressure. How energy is released. Whether there are patterns that shouldn't be possible under the current limits. And if something stands out, they go deeper. Now connect this to something very subtle. Mercedes' power delivery didn't just look strong. It looked consistent. Almost perfectly linear. No spikes. No sudden drops. Just smooth acceleration every single lap. And in this generation of cars, that is incredibly difficult to achieve. Because the systems are complex, sensitive, and heavily restricted. Which leads to one very uncomfortable possibility. Either Mercedes has mastered the system better than anyone else, or they have found a way to operate it differently. And that's where the line becomes thin. Because different, in Formula One, often leads to questioned. Now let's go one layer deeper. Because inside the paddock, teams don't react the same way to dominance. If someone is simply faster, they accept it. If someone is doing something they don't understand, they challenge it. And right now, Mercedes falls into that second category. Because the gap in China didn't look like normal performance gain. It looked like control over something others are still struggling with. And that's exactly why the situation escalated so quickly. From admiration, to curiosity, to scrutiny. Now here's the key detail. This kind of investigation doesn't need proof of wrongdoing to matter. Just the possibility is enough. Because it forces attention. It forces comparison. It forces Mercedes to operate under a different kind of pressure. And that changes everything. Because now, every lap they do, every deployment phase, every performance advantage, is being watched, analyzed, questioned. Not publicly, but internally. By the FIA, by rival teams, by everyone. And that creates a very different environment. Because dominance under pressure? is much harder to maintain. So what we saw in China might not just be a statement of strength. It might be the beginning of a test of whether Mercedes can keep that level, while everyone is trying to understand exactly how they are doing it. But here's where this story becomes much more serious and much more uncomfortable for Mercedes. Because once the FIA starts looking closer, it doesn't just stay between them and the team. Other teams get involved. Quietly at first, then more directly. Because Formula One is not just competition on track. It's competition off track as well. And when one team suddenly gains an advantage that others cannot explain, they don't wait. They question it. They challenge it. They push for answers. Now imagine what Red Bull, Ferrari, and the rest of the grid are doing right now. They are not just reviewing their own data. They are studying Mercedes, sector by sector, straight by straight, deployment phase by deployment phase, trying to understand one thing. Where is that extra performance coming from? And more importantly, is it repeatable? Because if it is, then Mercedes didn't just win a race. They unlocked something. Something that could define the entire season. But if it's not, if it depends on operating in a very specific window, or pushing the system beyond what is normally sustainable, then it becomes fragile. And that's where the FIA steps in. Not to punish, to understand, to control. Because their role is not just enforcing rules. It's protecting the balance of the sport. Now here's the critical detail. The FIA doesn't need to find something illegal to act. They only need to find something unclear. Something that sits in a gray area. Because in Formula One, gray areas don't last long. They get clarified. And when they get clarified, teams have to adjust. Sometimes slightly, sometimes significantly, but always with consequences. Now think about what that means for Mercedes. If their advantage comes from something completely legal and stable, they continue dominating. Nothing changes. But if part of that performance depends on an interpretation, a specific way of using the system, a detail that others are now questioning, then everything becomes uncertain. Because even a small clarification can remove a big advantage. And this is where dominance becomes fragile. Because what looked perfect in China might not be repeatable under new scrutiny. Now let's go deeper into the psychological side. Because this is not just happening in the FIA offices. It's happening inside the Mercedes garage as well. Engineers know they are being watched. Drivers know the car is under attention. Every run, every lap, every data point matters more now. And that creates pressure. Not panic, but awareness. And awareness changes behavior. Maybe you don't push as aggressively. Maybe you stay within safer limits. Maybe you avoid certain configurations. And without realizing it, you lose a fraction of performance. Just enough for others to close the gap. Now add another layer. Expectation. Because after China, Mercedes is no longer just a strong team. They are the benchmark, the reference, the team everyone is chasing. And that brings a different kind of pressure. Because now, you don't just have to be fast. You have to prove that your speed is sustainable, legal, repeatable, under scrutiny. And that is much harder than winning one race. Now here's the part that could change everything. If the FIA decides to issue a technical clarification, even a small one, it doesn't just affect Mercedes. It affects the entire grid. But it affects Mercedes the most. Because they are the ones extracting the most from the current interpretation. And when that interpretation shifts, they lose the most. That's how Formula One works. Now think about the timing again. This is only the second race of the season. Which means, there is still time for everything to change. For advantages to disappear. For new ones to emerge. For the balance of power to shift completely. And that's why this moment is so important. Because China was not just a dominant performance. It was a reveal. A glimpse of what Mercedes can do. But now, the entire sport is reacting to it. The FIA is watching. The rivals are analyzing. The pressure is building. So the real question is no longer how good Mercedes was in China. The real question is, how much of that performance will still be there when everyone starts pushing back? Because if Mercedes can keep it, they control the season. But if they can't, then what looked like dominance might turn into something much more unstable. And the next race will be the first real answer. And just when it feels like this is already as intense as it can get, there is one final layer that could completely flip the story. Because this is no longer just about performance. It's about precedent. And in Formula One, precedent is everything. Because what the FIA decides to do next doesn't just affect Mercedes. It sends a message to every single team on the grid about how far you can go, how aggressively you can push, and where the real limits actually are. Now think about this carefully. If the FIA looks at Mercedes, studies everything, and decides to do nothing, that sends a very clear signal that what Mercedes is doing is acceptable. And immediately, every other team starts moving in that direction, copying, adapting, trying to unlock the same performance. And suddenly, what looked like a unique advantage becomes the new standard. But if the FIA decides the opposite, if they step in, if they clarify something, if they tighten the interpretation even slightly, then the entire situation reverses. Because now, Mercedes becomes the reference point of what not to do. And that's where things get complicated. Because any change, no matter how small, forces a reset. Not just for Mercedes, but for everyone. Now here's the part most people don't realize. These kinds of decisions don't just affect performance. They affect development. Because teams plan upgrades weeks in advance. Months, sometimes. And those upgrades are based on assumptions. On what is allowed. On what is possible. So if the FIA changes the interpretation now, everything that was planned has to be reconsidered, reworked, sometimes even scrapped. And that creates chaos. Silent chaos. The kind that doesn't show on TV, but completely reshapes the season. Now bring this back to Mercedes. Because this is where the risk becomes real. If their advantage is built on something that becomes restricted, they don't just lose performance today. They lose direction for tomorrow. Because suddenly, the path they were following no longer exists. And finding a new path takes time. Time they might not have. Because while they adjust, others keep pushing. Others keep scoring. Others keep closing the gap. Now add one more layer. Confidence. Because right now, Mercedes is operating with total belief. The car works. The system works. Everything is aligned. But the moment that confidence is questioned, even slightly, it changes everything. Because engineers start doubting. Drivers start questioning. Decisions become slower, more cautious. And that's when performance starts to slip. Not dramatically, but enough. Always enough. Now imagine the next race. All eyes on Mercedes. Every onboard analyzed. Every straight compared. Every data trace examined. Not just by the FIA, but by every rival team. Looking for answers. Looking for proof. Looking for anything? That explains China. And that kind of attention is impossible to ignore. Because even if you are doing everything right, being watched changes how you operate. It always does. So now we arrive at the real turning point of this entire story. Not the investigation itself. Not the dominance in China. But what happens when both collide. Because this is the moment where Mercedes has to prove something. Not just that they are fast, but that they are sustainably fast. Legitimately fast. Repeatably fast. Under pressure. Under scrutiny. Under observation. And that is a completely different challenge. Because winning once is performance. Winning again, under investigation, that's proof. So now everything leads to one final question. Was China the beginning of a new Mercedes era? Or was it the peak of something that might not last? Because if Mercedes shows up at the next race and looks just as strong, just as controlled, just as dominant, then the answer is clear. They are ahead, and everyone else is chasing. But if even a small part of that advantage disappears, if the car looks slightly more limited, if the performance drops just enough to notice, then we will know that what happened in China was not just dominance. It was a moment right before everything changed.